Hello, this is your host, Ty Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as supporting me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. And be sure to check out my new Substack, which has been out for almost 2 months now. Okay, so to today's conversation, episode 48 of Rules for Intentional Communities, we will begin. So, while not all intentional communities are the same, they might, in fact, be very distinct from each other, ranging from ethnic separatists to eco-village to hippie commune, utopian socialism to religious communities. They are all sufficiently similar in their relationship to the hegemon they are living under, in that the hegemon imposes similar costs on existence to any and all intentional communities that live under it. For this reason, today's show will treat intentional communities as fungible for all practical purposes in regards to the hegemon, other cultural and political forces in society, and to the world at large. So, what is an intentional community? So, an intentional community, I define it as a community that is parallel to the reigning societal norms as a whole. Otherwise, it wouldn't be intentional. It would just be a part of society. And also one that usually holds to norms that are outside of the scope of society. In part, that's what impels them or drives them to be intentional. And it could be for any number of reasons, as I've already listed. The hegemon is that institution or force, or which could be a religious institution, such as the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. It could be a political institution, like an empire, or it could be a reigning intellectual paradigm, like modern scientism, or all three. And so people who form intentional communities are objecting to any one of these things and believing that in order to achieve some perceived good, they have to take make some radical choices and step outside of this reigning paradigm. And so, in what regard do these intentional communities relate to other things, like other intentional communities, other individuals, other hegemonic forces? So there are three major relations an intentional community can have with regard to others: political alignment, geographic proximity, and the power differential. So with political alignment, we have the full member, so the catechumen, the favorably disposed, the neutral, and the hostile. The full member is self-explanatory, whatever the values of your community are. These are people that are totally accepted by those inside the community and have already fully integrated themselves into that community by belief and practice. So anything that deals with that would be what we might call domestic policies, which we're not strictly dealing with today. We're dealing with how this would relate to external forces. But nonetheless, they're worth considering as, of course, the optimal situation to have. The second is the catechumen. These are those who are considering joining your community, are learning your ways, but are not fully committed. These are the... So in this, the reason why I choose catechumen is this is a concept that comes from Christian history and practice. There are those who wish to learn about Christianity for the purpose of joining any given Christian church. Now, it might turn out in the course of affairs that they don't actually join that church. Maybe they were under some misconception, or as they learn more about it, they either disagree with certain of its tenets or find its practice too rigorous. So the way any interested third party that might want to get involved with an intentional community is in a position very analogous to the catechumen, in which case I call him the catechumen. Now, there's basically one of two things that can happen now. One is you successfully convince this individual to join your group, and he becomes a full member, in which case he's now moved from the catechumen to the full member category. The other thing you can do is you can say, well, he doesn't join you. And if he doesn't join you, what's imperative is that this intentional community makes this termination as cordial as possible, termination of the relationship. One, because at some later date, he might reconsider and come back to your group. And if you make this break too acrimonious, that second chance may never develop. Or even if he does not come back, he could still harm you by giving a bad report. He might still give a bad report anyhow, but you shouldn't do him the honor of making that report true. So this is one important relationship to deal with, because he's not really in but he's living amongst you, but he's not really a part of you. And then the question is this someone who's a candidate for full membership or not? And if so, is this person willing to go through all the way? So the next group of people are those who respect and appreciate what you stand for, but for whatever reason do not wish to join the community. So one of the things that you can see with intentional communities is that there will be issues that even normies purport to value, but will actually do nothing to provide. You could see, for example, the radical environmentalist critique of liberals. Liberals will pay lip service to environmental concerns, but won't actually do anything about it. And the radical environmentalists actually won't do any much about it either, but that's neither here nor there. From the point of view of the radical environmentalist, they do claim, this is, they're not really putting their money where their mouth is. But nonetheless, liberals or centrists or whatever will have sympathetic feelings towards the radical environmentalists in a way that, say, conservatives don't. So if you can generate some sort of sympathetic feeling, even though they might view you as extreme in the pursuit of this good, they might view you, winsomely as someone who they wish they could be as committed as you. Or, it's a little extreme, but they're doing it for the right cause. Or, of course, this third group could be the case because they have pleasant dealings with you, whether they're business dealings or cultural dealings or whatever. You provide them with something, or you give them something that makes them kindly associated with you. Now, if we back this up to my discussion on friendship, what is a friend? When I mentioned Aristotle, we can say, well, another thing is the third and highest level of friendship is the love of the good soul, the great souled man. And if that's the case, you could then develop a virtuous soul so that you could still be friends with people that are outside of your community. Friendship is not necessarily bound by religious or community boundaries. For example, you could be friends from different nations, friends from different competing factions within, you think like ancient Greece, for example, we'd have one of the things that makes civil wars especially, but even wars between neighboring kingdoms difficult is it forces people who are friends to make a decision. You have a higher loyalty to your friend or a higher loyalty to the people that want you to go to war with this faction that your friend is a part of. If you were able to win friends, for example, a classic example would be Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee had a choice. He could either take the commission of the Union Army and invade Virginia, his home state, or take the Confederate commission and fight the Union government, in which he had been previously a part of the U.S. Army. Question of loyalties. You can put people in that question of loyalties perspective, favorably disposed. You can then make it more difficult for your enemies to take action against you. Then the fourth group is the neutral, or basically they don't care. In that regard, these are the people. This is the largest group in all likelihood, and are totally indifferent to you. They either do not even know of your existence, or if they are aware, have no strong feelings either way. This is basically a sleeping giant, and it's best left to be sleeping. Because, again, as an intentional community, you have far fewer resources at your disposal than the hegemon or other important institutions in society, in which regard you have to carefully spend the resources you have. And, let the sleeping dogs lie, as the old adage goes. So the neutrals, they could be bad if, like, some witch hunt is stirred up against you by certain persons, and then they all come together against you based on a sort of ignorant understanding of your position. But that's really more a question of dealing with those that are hostile to you, which I'll get to shortly. The last group are your enemies. These come in two kinds: people who oppose you based on a false understanding, and those who know what you stand for and are opposed to what you stand for. The former can be turned from the category of enemy to any of the prior categories listed if this misunderstanding is explained via dialogue. The latter are incorrigible and must be isolated. John Boyd said the goal of strategy is to keep your enemies politically isolated. An intentional community can do this in a few ways. Make yourself indispensable, make friends, keep a low profile. Your enemies will generally act against you if one of the or other of two conditions are met. One, they feel likely they have enough broad-based support to attack you without too much blowback. Blowback is basically the unintended consequences of actions. That was something that Ron Paul was famous for popularizing in his 2008 and 2012 presidential campaign run with regards to the war on terror and the 9/11 attack. And or two, they are desperate and view you as an existential threat throwing calculation to the winds. 2 can be avoided if you keep a low profile and do not threaten them in the extreme. Now, they might still believe you are a threat based on your values or beliefs, but if you don't act in an extremely provocative way, they're not likely to be placed psychologically in the situation of, if I don't do X, we're done, and which makes people desperate. One can be offering some sort of service that is widely accepted to be invaluable, and the loss would militate against direct action against you and advance you in making friends. So your friends will put pressure on your enemies to lay off. So, for example, if it turns out the case that you provide an inordinate amount of physicians from your community, and they're particularly good physicians, the pressure would be, well, if we take these people out, we have a huge hit to our medical services, which would affect everybody adversely. The question is some people will make that calculation and bite the bullet, but it makes the action cost of that calculation much more expensive. And your goal is to make that action cost as expensive as possible. Geographic proximity. Okay, we can divide them into people living among you, people living nearby, people living a moderate distance from you, and people living far away. Those living among you come of 3 kinds: your own members, catechumens, and foreign representatives. The first 2 have already been described. The last ones are agents of other groups who for business or other reasons are living among you. This last group must be treated with care, since they have the power to do you great harm or great good, depending on the report they give to those to whom they serve. Next, we have people who live nearby. These are the people who are basically your neighbors and the most likely to be favorable or ill-disposed to you, depending on how you treat them. Okay, 2 really good examples of what I mean by this. One, of course, is not quite so well known, but there was a Netflix documentary about it a few years back about Osho, the sort of like sex Hindu cultist that moved to Oregon and tried to take over the state. By acting in an extremely aggressive and confrontational way, not only did he offend the local Oregonians, but got in trouble with the federal government and got arrested. So that's not how you build an intentional community. Or you could be like the Amish and generally have people that are kindly disposed to you, even if they think you're extreme and quaint. So those are the 2 extremes of how that can turn out. But of course, it's easier to invest time in those that live nearby to have a favorable impression of you. And given your limited resources, it's probably for the best that you spend most of those resources dealing with them to build that kind of relationship. Okay, outside of those who live in your community, these are the people with which you have the most exposure and the ones you have the most chance of winning to your cause. This is essential for if the hegemon seeks to take action against you, they will often work through the local power structure, which if it already hates you will not be very hard. Those who live in a moderate distance are those who, in the U.S. context, might live a couple of states away. They are close enough to be considered in some detail, but not more than those who live nearby. They might be mostly indifferent toward you due to geographic distance. Those who live far away will likely have never heard of you and are the least important to consider, with one major exception: the hegemonic power itself. Most intentional communities, for obvious reasons, will establish themselves at the extremities of the hegemon's power, out of sight, out of mind. Yet, you must pay very special attention to the hegemon. It is more than most predisposed to be your enemy. This is not a foregone conclusion, though. Through shrewd diplomacy and prudent action, the hegemon can be turned toward neutral or even favorable with the disposition of benign neglect. Some intentional communities become hegemons in themselves, and they do this in part by either overthrowing the existing hegemon or making itself so attractive to the existing hegemon that they are inducted into the system. Case in point, the first example will be the Mormons. They went from a minority group, the Puritans and the Mormons, they both went from minority groups at the edge of the hegemony of their power structure to dominant power structures. Or they're invited in, with Constantine inviting in the Christians as a way to sort of co-opt them. But we have examples of both throughout history. At this point, they cease to be intentional communities, but hegemons, and therefore fall outside the scope of this discussion. Power differential. Those weaker than you, those of equivalent strength with you, and those who are stronger than you. As a community, you are generally stronger than any individual or even other communities. This puts you in a dominant position vis-a-vis them. There are peer groups, other intentional communities, or small tolerated societal organizations such as guilds, fraternities, etc. They're more or less in your weight class, to use the boxing analogy, in which case you have to treat them as equals and peers, Lastly, these are organizations that are more powerful than yourself: transnational corporations, states, global churches, and empires. Obviously, transnational corporation would be Walmart, a global empire would be the British Empire, global church might be the Catholic Church. Global reach, large reach. If you are an intentional community, say in Denmark, the state of Denmark is your hegemon, but if a larger nation, say Germany, invades Denmark, they are the hegemon over both you and Denmark. Not all hegemons are equal, so maybe more or less disposed to you, act accordingly. And of course, the direct political hegemon might be a minor state in a larger geopolitical game, in which case they may not be the most important people for you to worry about. And the people that are more powerful that either invade or take over or influence the smaller state that you're living in might be more or less favorably disposed to you than that state. So again, something to keep in mind. Another consideration is autonomy. Your goal is to depend as little as possible on the reigning hegemony. Otherwise, why are you an intentional community? Total independence might be physically unfeasible. One might, of course, come to some wild and untamed land like the Puritans and Mormons, where there is no overarching authority above them because there's nobody there, or nobody with sufficient political organization. I mean, they were Native Americans, but they were less politically sophisticated than the Puritans and Mormons. This will likely not be an option for a modern intentional community, unless we're talking about after the collapse, in which case maybe it is. Autonomy, which is direct control over the economic, social, and political needs of your own community, ensures maximum range of action, allowing you to operate independently from the hegemon as much as possible, right? Because if you're dependent upon some third party for a good or service, that third party has some influence, claim, or control over you. Since, of course, you're trying to be independent of them, you need to figure out how to be as autonomous as possible from that reigning paradigm, self-sufficiency being the main way of doing that. Autonomy can be strengthened by offering your services and practicing camouflage. I'll explain more below. In short, maximizing your range of actions and learning how to blend in is essential for building an intentional community. Okay, so how do we strategically isolate our enemies? Given that you're an intentional community, we're going to be outgunned and outspent and out-influenced by many people, not just the hegemon of the state, but also powerful institutions like possibly the university, some religious institution, business institutions. That isn't if they even care about you, which they might not. Options to strategically isolate your enemies. 1, offer indispensable services. If you offer a service that is both high quality and essential, even people ill-disposed to you will think twice before taking action. Such services include, but are not limited to, education, medicine, arbitration, energy production, and foodstuffs. So again, if, for example, a tyrant acts against your community and his empire's supply of trained physicians plummets, then he might not in fact act against you. Or, since he is consumed by folly, after all he's a tyrant ruled by his passions, he does act against you. His outrageous behavior might lead to an invasion from without or revolution from within. So, for example, Saddam's outrageous treatment of the Kurds and Shiites made it easy for the U.S. to justify the 2003 invasion. Or the tyranny of King John made it easy for the barons to rally against him. So, even if a tyrant takes direct action against you, if you have raised the action cost, and I take this term from like video games, especially turn-based tactics. So a classic one was called Talonsoft, and they had basically there was East Front, West Front, and Pacific, and this was like a '90s game that was pretty popular, at least amongst like the very serious war gamers, where each action there was an action cost to cross terrain, action cost to fire a weapon, action cost to unload from a truck, and of course, everybody had a fixed action cost of 100. So then the question is, if you keep on raising, everybody has a fixed set of action costs depending on various factors. And if you raise the action cost so high that they have to basically expend political capital, that's one way of measuring action costs, such that they can't do anything else after the fact, or sign a check they can't actually pay, and there's a blowback massively, that might be the end of the regime that decided to attack you. But again, you have to play your cards right. And I'm not saying an intentional community should seek a revolution unless it wants to take over, in which case it's no longer really an intentional community. But it's a sort of like nuclear option, a kind of Samson option, that you've raised the action cost so high that if they do act, they're going to have a world of hurt coming down their way. The next is cultural exchange. Most hostility to your intentional community will arise from misunderstandings. The best way to prevent that is to have representatives go to the other relevant communities and win them over, or exchange representatives or host cultural events, food, music, etc., to better acquaint people with your values and goals. This breaks down the barrier of ignorance, which is often used by the unscrupulous to breed hatred. The original use of the term hostage meant to exchange political, not even prisoners, but political representatives of valuable members of the ruling class of each society to live with each other as a pledge of a treaty. A famous example would be Aegis living with the Huns, which he then puts this in a good use later on when he fights Attila. The idea being then that the implication that the hostage would be imprisoned or killed if the pledge was broken. This can be a good way of ensuring peace and offering cultural exchange. Of course, vis-a-vis the hegemon, actually threatening the hostage and breach of faith will be less effective. But nonetheless, all of these things can, if pursued correctly, lead to a better understanding in the relevant wider communities. So when it comes to applying cultural exchange as a strategy or cultural engagement as a strategy, obviously you're going to want to spend most of your time living with the people that nearby, because that's the most of your human interactions are going to come from those people. But there are exceptions to that, people that come from various distances who represent other groups and institutions. Of course, people that represent the reigning hegemon, whether that be religious, political, or economic, all should be treated with care and should probably be specially targeted to at least be neutral to you, if not sympathetic. And this could be, of course, one way to do that. Related to this, cultural exchange would be back to offering an indispensable service such as education. If, for example, you become widely considered through experience, experts in any particular field of education, to quote the old adage, Muhammad will come to the mountain. So the idea is if you become the mountain and Muhammad comes to you, education is a form of influence and power over other people. So, as a hypothetical example, let's say that one intentional community becomes widely respected for its, teaching on some historical subject, say, the American Revolution. This is an example. And everybody goes to anybody that wants to learn about the American Revolution goes to that intentional community to learn. Well, that has a lot of sway, because even if that person doesn't join your community, you shaped him, and as he goes back into the broader society and teaches, he will have at least a favorable impression of you and your community, and might, in fact, in his lectures and course of life, make positive statements about your community, which could potentially influence others to join you. Medicine's another obvious example. As well as even pedagogy itself, the mode or structure of education. If you become known as the people that train teachers, and everybody wants to come to you to be trained as a teacher, even if they don't join your community, that still gives you a tremendous influence over others, which has to be handled with care, of course, but if handled correctly, could lead to more support for your community. Lastly, for strategic isolation, this is actually more of a defensive operation rather than proactive, is camouflage. As an intentional community, you should avoid the use of outright force or litigation to push around those weaker or peers to you. So as I mentioned, individuals or weaker communities or peer communities, this will attract what the mob calls heat. This will attract the wrong kind of attention and give your enemies plausible cause to act against you. The goal here is to outthink your enemies. The hegemon has more of everything than you, at least in a material sense. What the hegemon will likely not have more of is creativity. And so, for example, precisely because the hegemon is hegemonic, it is going to impose costs on thinkers. Many thinkers will go along with it because it ensures a certain standard of living, a certain level of prestige that, up to a point, they're willing to put up with. But there are those that don't. They tend to be the more creative and free-thinking spirits. Again, they may not be a perfect fit for your intentional community, but if you offer them something that the hegemon can't, such as, freedom to think, you're more likely to attract them. And that will give you, and if you end up attracting people like that, then you end up having a sort of competitive advantage over the hegemon, sort of the aging, calcified dinosaur versus the, young and supple athlete. So in that regard, you can have a competitive advantage that way. As your hegemon calcifies through dogma and runs into epistemic limits due to its size, you have the advantage of being formless like water and evading their detection. In the 39 Steps, John Buchan gives an account of how Haney, when he was hunting in Africa with his greyhound, failed to catch a reebok, which is an African antelope, who seemed to vanish into thin air. To quote, it, the reebok, didn't need to run away. All it had to do was stand still and melt into the background. Prey animals often have a survival mechanism, the ability to hide in plain sight as long as they stand still. A key facet of strategy is to make the enemy think he is seeing what he expects to see. For if he sees what he expects to see, he will be none the wiser. Many a revolution occurred right under the noses of the authorities in plain sight, and yet they didn't see it coming. Hide in plain sight, and you will do well to avoid detection and reaction from the hegemon. So ultimately, what we're really talking about is what I call the Eye of Sauron, or the sort of regime's awareness of your existence. Right? There is a certain threshold below which the regime will not detect you, not see you, either because it's not aware of you, or B, even if it is aware of you, you've been acting in such a manner that you were one step ahead of it. Think of a game of chess. How do you win a game of chess? You have to think multiple moves in advance of the person you're playing against. And if we envision this is a giant chess game, and the checkmate position is when the hegemon has you fully in his sights, has you politically isolated, and is mustering forces to destroy you, Waco, you're done. That's it. It's over. So the goal then, whether you want to remain an intentional community or become a new hegemon, is to not have that happen. And the first thing you have to do is you have to understand what philosophy and principles and guidelines that hegemony has. Because what's going to end up happening is most hegemonies are the result of a kind of hypernormalization where they overly simplify reality in order to make it easier for the bureaucracy to interact with everybody beneath them, which leaves out vast swaths of lived experience, such that it never enters into their mind that such a thing might be done. Sauron didn't envision that the council would destroy the ring, never entered into his mind. He was so blinded by his own passions and desires and his own belief about power that everyone was just like him. Well, use that to your advantage. Figure out what that is. Figure out what they say can't be, but we all know from experience is. So, so for example, the powers that be want to pretend that there's no fundamental difference between the sexes. Okay, well, there are. And it's called biological essentialism. But then the question is, okay, how can you use that to your advantage, right? You know this, they don't. So you can use that to stay one step ahead of them. The same goes for a whole bunch of other beliefs that this and other hegemonies have. And of course, smaller intentional communities could still run the risk of being hypernormalized, but there isn't really the pressure to oversimplify life in order to make it easier to engage with, because there are fewer moving parts and fewer people to engage with. So you can be more honest in how you interact with reality, which gives you a competitive advantage, since hypernormalization is the efficient cause by which we generate simulations, which leads to the simulacrum. Of course, the simulacrum will eventually collapse into the desert of the real. And again, the closer the intentional community is to reality, and the further away the hegemon is in the land of simulation, if not hyper-reality itself. Again, even in a direct force-on-force conflict within Afghanistan, we saw that the Taliban was able to outlast and beat the United States, because the United States, according to the Bush administration, can create its own reality, which is a laughable absurdity, and the Taliban knew better. And against all the odds, they won. So again, even in a direct confrontation with the U.S. military, being rooted in the real world gives you the decisive edge that the U.S. military doesn't have. And so Not that you should ever escalate to that point with a well-managed intentional community, but I'm just giving a worst-case scenario and how even in that worst-case scenario, this mindset still is decisive. So the other thing is politically isolated, right? Because now if the regime is going to try to politically isolate you, the hegemony is going to want to isolate you so that when it mobilizes force against you, it can appear justified. Now, normally this is the 800-pound gorilla picking on a baby. So how do they sell this? Well, again, Waco is a good example. They intentionally conflate two kinds of extremism. One can be extreme in that they believe something or a set of beliefs that are far outside of the norm. And you can also be extreme in the measures you use to acquire your goals. Often these two are intentionally conflated, partly on purpose, because it's convenient for them to do so, and also partly because they're one-dimensional thinkers that aren't capable of making such a subtle distinction. And if you give them reason to think so, like stockpiling an armory, whether you're black nationalists like MOVE in 1985 or religious separatists like Waco, that's a good way to isolate yourself. And if they can scare the normies, what we might call the largest group, those that don't care one way or the other about you, they can then take extreme action against you, and it looks like self-defense, which to any reasonably minded person is insane, given the 800-pound gorilla beating up on a baby. But it's all about perception. And so, and in fact, from the point of view of a revolutionary, the best thing to do is to politically isolate the regime. But that's if you have a different set of goals. And some revolutionary movements start off as intentional communities. But again, then they cease to be an intentional community once they take power. So I'm only dealing with this phase of whatever social organization you're talking about. And keeping the regime politically isolated is actually a really good thing to do. You might say, well, how can you do that? Well, it's hard, but it can be done. I mean, we all know situations in which people in positions of authority, the government, business, police, or military, are considered basically the bad guys by the community. Well, I mean, think of any insurgency, right? One of the difficulties the U.S. had in Iraq and Afghanistan was they were considered illegitimate, and the insurgents could count on the loyalty of the people to hide them, to cover for them, and it made it very difficult for the U.S. to do anything about it. Now, again, when I'm assuming this is below the threshold of an insurgency, but they could still wage lawfare against you. They could still make your life miserable in other ways, having the the tax collectors come after you, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you have enough people in the right places that are sympathetic to you, that might have a crisis of loyalty, like say Robert E. Lee, and choose you over the regime, you can keep the regime politically isolated, because if the regime is worth its salt, it will have war gamed a lot of scenarios, and it will realize, if you play your card right, that while you yourself might have no chance against the full might of the regime has other commitments. If it's a hegemon, it has other geopolitical commitments. I mean, the United States can't muster its entire fleet in the Mediterranean, for example. It has to have a fleet all over the world. And it has domestic concerns, what other people might think. It could lead to a revolution if you attack this group, and other people who already view you as tyrannical and outrageous might. So, for example, right, if something like Waco were to happen again, it would quite likely lead to a revolution. Many on the American right believe so, and I think the government does too, which is why it hasn't done another Waco since 1993, at least not yet. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, at least in part. There are other ways this could happen too, but this is the most obvious one we can refer to in American history. And so it is also doing this against you as well, trying to politically isolate you and then win friends from the community and then take you out. But ultimately, I think the key thing that any intentional community can offer that the society cannot is a sense of community itself and meaning, right? So a lot of people who survived the Waco siege were asked, why did you do this? I mean, David Koresh is crazy, right? All these requirements and commands. Same for the Osho cult. A lot of people will tell you, yeah, but I got something there that I didn't get anywhere else. I got community, some sort of spiritual, cultural experience that could not be replicated in the broader community as a whole. And so some weird things like cults and gangs, what needs to be explained is why would people want to join them? Well, in part because they're offering something to some people that they're not getting in the world as large. And to those people that value whatever's being offered, even if they have a steep asking price to get in, they are willing to accept that because within their rational calculation, they believe the good that this gang or cultist or intentional community is offering is better than the one that they are getting now in society. And ultimately, I think that is the key weapon that any intentional community has, that it offers a better way of doing things. And that can be in one of two ways. One is, you just buy in whole hog to the system, to this new way of thinking. People are like, yep, this is just hands down better than anything else. We're going to join you. That would be like early Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Or it could be, well, we don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, but they show that another way of life is possible. So as long as they exist, one, they show the lie of the hegemon that theirs is the only way. And B, insofar as they've developed an intentional community, can be seen as an inspiration for others to imitate up to a point. Hence, the implied fungibility, which is just a useful theoretical fiction. Obviously, in reality, they're not fungible. Second of all, though this is beyond the scope of today's discussion, there are certain intentional communities that have values that are more consistent with all of these practices and those that are not. So, for example, if a Stalinist intentional community, for example, would be a very interesting contradiction, because ultimately if they achieved all of their goals, they would no longer be an intentional community and would act in all the aggressive pathological ways that would probably get you snuffed out long before you got to that point. So, to summarize all of this as we wrap it up, 1, if we assume intentional communities are fungible for the purpose of describing their relationship to the hegemon and other influential institutions as a theoretical fiction that is useful to illustrate these points precisely because they stand in a very similar, the costs imposed externally are the same on all of them, even if they react differently to them. There are 3 ways you can relate to this intentional community: political alignment, geographic proximity, and power differential. For political alignment, you have a full member, who's somebody who's already a part of your group; a catechumen, somebody who's interested in joining your group; favorably disposed, not interested in joining you, but either respect you for your dedication or the services you offer; neutral, don't know, don't care; hostile, wants to destroy you. Geographic proximity, people that live among you, people that live nearby, people that live a moderate distance, people that live far away. The first group includes your own members, catechumens, and foreign representatives living nearby, most likely to be friends or enemies depending on your behavior. Think of Osho versus the Amish. And then living far away, in all likelihood, that's where the hegemon is, so you still have to care about some people living far away. Power differential, those that are weaker than you, those that are of equivalent strength, and those that are stronger than you. In which way you deal with any of these, you should avoid direct use of force and litigation, because that just raises the heat level to a degree that you really can't really accommodate. So it's best just not to do that. You also need to remember those more powerful than you are not just the direct state that you're living under, but other neighboring states that might try to invade that state, and then act accordingly. Your goal as an intentional community is to maintain autonomy, which is the direct control over your economic, social, and political needs, so that you can act without having to be, as much as possible, without being under the influence or control of the system that exists. And maintaining that autonomy is what makes you an intentional community rather than something else. And then how do you strategically isolate your enemies? Well, you can offer indispensable services such that, and I listed, but not reducible to only these, education, medicine, arbitration, energy production, and foodstuffs, such that you raise the action cost of your opponents, such that they will hopefully not act against you. And even if they choose to act against you, it might be the last mistake they make, because they just brought down the house on their heads when everybody else is like, hey, wait, we didn't sign up for losing these services by your outrageous behavior. cultural exchange, which can be, cultural events, exchange of representatives, a kind of hostage system in the original sense of the word. Camouflage, which is basically blending in with your environment, not acting in a way that the enemy can look right at you and not see you. And then, of course, being outside of the eye of Sauron, and you do that by knowing the limitations of the reigning ideology of the hegemony, and then acting out of it, specifically acting in such a way on principles that they believe are impossible, which are actually not impossible. It's a fiction they've created for the sake of hyper-normalization to make the world simple enough for them to engage with because it's too complicated and vast. Whereas as an intentional community, you don't have to worry about that as much because you're smaller, fewer moving parts, you can be more honest about reality. And they are going to try to think it's a game of chess. You're playing, well, see though, you're playing against the hegemony and they're playing against other hegemonies, other internal forces. So they're playing multiple games of chess. And it's going to be a lot easier for them to lose these multiple games of chess than you losing to them if you play your cards right, because you have fewer competitors to play against. And not all enemies will be the hegemony. That's just the most likely one. Some of them could be individuals. Some of them could be other communities. But again, if you play your cards right, you're going to have a lot less enemies than they do, which means they're playing far more games of chess than you do, and they have to be winning those games and thinking ahead. And history shows us that they usually don't. So that puts you in an advantage there. That's tonight's discussion on intentional communities. Let's see what we have in the chat. Cyber Ninja Zero, hello. Minoan, hello. GF, Actual Physical Kelp, Trouble Armstrong, hello. Yes, Cyber Ninja Zero, the better you are, the more action points it costs to destroy you. Exactly. And everybody has a fixed amount of action points. So your goal is to raise the cost of their action so that if we're playing a turn-based game, that's the only action they take, and it completely ruins the board state for them. Oh, super chat. Ori Samsonov for 42 shekels. Thank you so much. You're a loyal supporter, Ori. To help kickstart your intentional community. One can wish, everybody, small dreams. Or big dreams start small, I should say. Let's see. We have Lela Thornix. I think an incredibly important overlooked point about intentional communities is the importance of investing in small-scale industrial production. Well, it depends on if you want to be outside the industrial system as much as possible. So like a radical environmentalist group might want to do that, for example. But yeah, smart-scale investment. I know people have been floating the idea of 3D printing around, so maybe you're thinking of that. Cyber Ninja Zero, it already happened twice in quick succession. Fun fact, Waco was planned as a way to win PR after Ruby Ridge. The government is so incompetent that it can only F up again. Yep. Ruby Ridge 3, Waco 2 will happen for the same reason Waco did. The government's destructive capabilities outpacing its propaganda capabilities. Bingo. Exactly. Ultimately, the government that we have now is a dinosaur led by incompetence. And it's really their game to lose, and they will lose it. Trouble Armstrong, man cannot live by bread alone. Human beings will die for an idea or an identity or culture. Yes. Yes. Oswald Spengler, I didn't catch the whole show, but what do you think of the Kunzlerian relation of geography to intentional communities? Geography of news from nowhere. Well, so there's two ways Kunzler talks about geography. One is the sort of hellscape that is suburbia, creating this horrible place to live in where people become suicide watch. Yeah, you want to leave that. Anything that's marginally better than suburbia, which is pretty much almost anything, would be a sufficient inducement to leave. Yes. Two, he also talks about, geography as strategic environmental concerns in terms of collapse. So like in his book, The Long Emergency, 2006, he talks about the different regions of North America. And one region he considers to be favorably well-placed is the Midwest, which is basically the region between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. And he says there's a lot of water, a lot of arable land, probably one of the better places to be when the collapse happens. So that's a possibility too. Well, everybody, that's all I have for tonight. Hope you were enjoyed and edified by this. And again, the reason why I treated intentional communities as fungible is because, not that they actually are all the same, but that they're fungible enough with relationship to these factors that anybody coming from any intentional community would find something valuable here. This is Todd Lewis of the Manoa, the Midwest Rules. Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.